My guest today is Mike Shortino, a principal digital strategist for federal civilian government at Salesforce. Mike, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
Let me set just a little bit of context for our discussion. Trust and transparency are really at the heart of agencies' digital transformation strategies. It's part of how agencies use data. It's part of how they secure their systems, and it's part of how they serve their mission area and serve citizens. And given the pace of change across the federal landscape over the last few years, agencies must take advantage of this rare opportunity to transform their services to both internal and external customers. They must do that differently. They must do it better, and they must do it in a way that engenders both trust and transparency. And agencies seem to be making some progress. The January 2023 report from the American Customer Service Index found federal government services surged in 2022, up 4.6% to 66.3 on their 100-point scale. ACSI found among those drivers of satisfaction, 2 of the 4 increased substantially between 21 and 22. Those were efficiency and ease of government processes and the ease of accessing clarity and the clarity of information. Other 2 drivers of satisfaction, they actually decrease only slightly: the courtesy and professionalism of customer service and the perceptions of government website quality. So how can agencies improve customer experience through digital transformation? Well, that's where, Mike, you come in. You're going to tell us about how they do that. So let's just start at that beginning. Digital transformation, we know why it's important, but really, what's really the driving some of those factors today for government?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think even the definition of digital transformation, and with someone with a digital strategist as his title, or principal digital strategist, certainly the meaning of the word digital transformation, or the term digital transformation, has changed over the several years that I've been working at Salesforce. When I first came here, we were really focused on what I would call modernization out of the federal government. And so if you can think back to data center consolidation, cloud first, really, led to a lot of lifting and shifting of existing systems. It didn't really change the outcome or the experience for the constituents or the customers in play. There's also been, I'd say several waves of kind of magic in a bottle type thinking. And so people talk about robotic process automation or just automation in general. These are just tools. They need to be guided by intent and adopted by end users to actually matter at the end of the day. We've also had unfunded mandates. So a shift to agile, DevOps, shared services, category management, general consolidation. These also don't equal transformation. And so I'm heartened by the focus on the actual experience. Connecting service silos across the government is a shift. When I first came to Salesforce, we were preaching that experience mattered, and I think that the federal government in policy, statute, and action is really caught up to that. But I think to complicate matters really depends where you sit in the government, what part of the mission you're accomplishing, to orient yourself on that change and making sure that we're changing to a positive end. And so understanding what's in statute is a key difference between the public sector and the private sector. On the private side, we can think about boundless opportunities and jobs to be done. And on the public side, a lot of times we have to wait for policy or statute to catch up with the need. And then I also would say that, we've seen more mission change growth. The rate of change appears to be going up. And so this recognition that certain things are changing faster, certain things aren't, right? So understanding what part of the mission is being challenged and focusing in that area can really help as well. So hopefully I answered your question there.
There's a couple of pieces I want to just take a half a step back on.
Sure.
I've heard recently from some CIOs and others, federal technology executives in government and in industry, that we're almost in that next set of cloud, right? The first set of cloud was, what is cloud? How does cloud work? Data center consolidation and cloud first, cloud lifting and shifting. And now, the second if you will, level was cloud smart. Okay, really what goes in the cloud, what makes sense. Now we're entering that third phase of cloud. And I think this is where you're getting to, where customers are driving the cloud. Without getting too into the cloud, for lack of a better word, is that really what's the difference today than it was 3, 5, 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an aspect of leveraging the masses there that's inherent in scalable cloud, what we would call software as a service, especially based solutions, but even with platform tools. The more folks that are using it, the more feedback we get as an organization, the better we can make those tools for our end users. And so recognizing that and adopting out of the box principles where they make sense for the organization has been a big shift. It's been a shift that we've been, I would humbly say, a part of leading in the government, which is thinking about, similar to how we used to think about COTS versus custom build within the government, thinking about those pre-developed capabilities that are really fed by those masses and by the consumers across multiple different organizations that we serve, and benefiting from that. And so a lot of what we do is connect to those capabilities, but also the patterns of success that agencies have achieved by leveraging those capabilities, or just by leveraging any capability, right? And so thinking about that kind of what we call a platform mindset of, leverage first, then code or create second, as a way to really speed time to value for your constituents.
I think there's also that acceptance of that commercial products, the idea of software as a service, that, hey, we don't need to do our own thing. And then the lack of being able to get people to do the work too. I mean, when it was all COBOL and mainframes, that's one thing, but as things moved into the cloud, as things moved to this idea of, well, I can't hire enough people, just like Salesforce probably struggles to hire enough people who have coding backgrounds. It's a big challenge for the entire organization. The other side of the coin, of course, is what the customers expect. And there's a lot of that's being driven by what's happening in the private sector. How much do you think the government is feeling that push? We know probably a lot, but how much of that push is the other reason why we're digital transformation looks different today than it did, again, 3, 5, 7 years ago?
Yeah, no, I think that it's something that, I used to work at an analyst firm, and we talked about it as, hey, the expectations for all services are changing, and they're being shaped by the bar that's set in our personal lives. And so at that point, it was really thinking about how we're bringing in our expectation for use of a mobile device in our personal life to how we're using it in our professional life. But I think that same wave of expectation change has hit the government. It was reflected, I think, indirectly in the reduction in trust that now, thankfully, we're seeing gains again in that perception of trust in the government, and which directly translates to the effectiveness of the programs that the government undertakes. But understanding that that wave of expectation change is just like all waves. It's going to continue with more and more waves of expectations changing. In fact, we do a yearly survey called the State of the Connected Customer. And you guys have to check me on that, make sure I didn't screw that up. But it's core research for Salesforce, because we do look at not only that set of expectations across demographics, right? Different age groups, different countries, but there's some consistency there in terms of changing expectations. And I think that the government is starting to respond to that effectively.
The survey you talk about, and I think we see a lot of very similar surveys about the state of connected customers or the state of customers. Is there any trends you'd point to in the federal world that has really, about the way customers are expecting federal agencies to act, or the way federal agencies, vice versa, are asking customers, what do you need from us? What are some of those big trends you're seeing?
Well, I mean, and certainly one of those big generational shift is the perception or the need for self-service, or the preference for self-service, right? And so, I don't want to label myself generationally, but I'm kind of in this bridge generation between the folks that were used to picking up the phone and calling someone, or going physically to a brick and mortar kind of facility to get their service met. So think of the local post office as a perfect example. that organization needs to service their traditional customers, which is, the folks that want to walk in off the street or in their local neighborhood and get service. And they also have to now increasingly support on the next generation who wants to really go online and have that kind of capability that they would get from other package or messaging providers, right? And so understanding that when you send a package or a letter that's going to get to its intended destination, and that you might have more visibility on that process than you did in the past. And so self-service, your pizza tracker type functionality, these types of things are moving from the from personal into professional, into the government. Increasingly, the use of bots, which is not, a panacea by any means, but the expectation that, hey, if, I don't want to wait online, on the actual phone line this time, or maybe even, at a website for a chat response from an actual person, maybe that chat bot can fill in. And especially where we've seen big spikes in demand through the pandemic, or even before, with Real ID rollouts at our state and local customers, caused big spikes in demand for information from constituents to say, hey, listen, do I have to update my license or passport, or, I missed a trip, now I need to make a change. All of those types of event-based spikes in demand is something that, I think government organizations are getting more, able to deal with, and platforms like Salesforce play a big role in that.
What are you still seeing as maybe those biggest challenges to getting toward or getting better digital transformation, or what's standing in the way of digital transformation? I imagine data, of course, but I'm sure there's more than that.
Well, I'm a big believer in I think it was Drucker that said that culture eats strategy for lunch. I hope I got that one right.
You got that right. Yep.
But I'm also a big believer in the fact that culture is built on success, right? The culture exists because it's a set of behaviors that worked in the past for us. And so the only way to change that culture is to show that there's a better way, or at least as good a way, doing it a different way. And so the government, often is challenged with its culture, but, I think we need to honor that culture and see how we can leverage that culture for advantage. And so that's a consistent headwind, but I think your more enlightened leaders are starting to turn that into a tailwind, right? And so, looking to take that head on, recognizing that there's going to be, in some cases, resistance to change, but that's based on natural inclination of human beings, and we have to kind of plan for that up front. So, here I am, the tech guy, talking about the people aspects of change, but I think that is a consistent headwind for sure. The other aspect I might have alluded to earlier is that some things are just set in statute, right? And so, like, the bounds of what we can and can't do are sometimes defined by that statute or law or policy. And so, thinking outside of the box, having a beginner's mindset is really important, but ultimately recognizing that there are going to be constraints, and that we have to understand what we can and can't do, and what we can and can't change as a result, is really important. I'd also say that just the nature of how government funds on an almost yearly basis, for the most part, really can hurt transformation efforts, because often you want to take this very incremental, lean, agile approach, is what some people would label it as. Well, that works really well in the private sector, where you've got the commitment of a board of directors or shareholders on a certain direction, and we can fund a lot of times on a multi-year basis transformation initiatives. That's much more difficult in the federal government. And so, just one example of the fuel for transformation is often those dollars to fund the butts and seats, if you'll excuse the expression. That aspect of this is really difficult, because it can often take on a staccato nature and be very hard to kind of connect this year to next year to the year after. Also, the way that the government acquires technology can be a challenge as well, because and we often want to protect the taxpayer by having a firm fixed scope to the work that we're doing, but you can't always predict where you're going to go. And so understanding that lean, agile, incremental approach is going to need some adjustments in terms of how we're funding and acquiring technology, especially. And then also just thinking about how we're building that long-term change step by step. I would say those three things together are headwinds, but I think the more enlightened leaders are kind of turning those into tailwinds as they go.
You brought up culture, you brought up acquisition, you brought up funding, all the hard things in government. You didn't even bring up technology once, which just shows you how far we've actually come. Yeah. Mike, on that note, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue our conversation. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Mike Shortino, a principal digital strategist for federal civilian government at Salesforce. Mike, we talked last segment about really what digital transformation is, why it's been changing, how the customer is driving a lot of it. And a lot of those are some of those trends that you kind of mentioned. Let's dig deeper into them. Let's just ask you, what are some of the trends that is driving these digital transformation imperatives?
Well, I would say that, after years of what probably felt like a lot of stagnation to both folks working in the government and folks being served by the government, we've seen a lot of change over the last several years. So, I would say that, and there's a recognition that this is not a single wave, as we talked about with the changing perceptions. We can expect there to be, the next crisis or the next imperative for change from the next administration. And so the idea that change is now a constant, that we can move from a crisis like a supply chain crisis to a response like, applying industrial policy to the implications, which are new grant programs, incentives, and reporting requirements, and that cycle of mission growth or change is something that we should really be planning for. But again, being able to kind of focus where the change is and not where it's not, and not needed to be addressed. So that's probably trend number one, which is a bit of an omni-trend.
Let me just jump in real quick on that trend number one, because I think it's important to highlight, because of the agility that platforms, whether again Salesforce or whoever you're using, gives you, agencies are able to adjust to that crisis much differently. As we saw during the pandemic, where they had a supply chain problem and they didn't know where the data was, and they didn't understand the different systems. And I think that's probably the big lesson learned as well, is that the agility matters.
Correct. Yeah, I know there's layers of our architecture and our organization where we can predict where that change is going to be more acute, right? And so like where you touch your constituents, I think we're finding is and those expectations are changing, like we talked about. Well, that's a natural layer of change within your organization that you need to be kind of attuned to.
Mike, you were going through the imperatives of change. You talked about change is constant. What are some of the others? Yeah,
so I'd say trust. We talked about the improvements in service delivery resulting in increased trust, but that imperative for thinking about trust as a bit of a buffer to mission execution, and that the last few years have exposed gaps in performance, and that's eroded trust, but really we need to earn it back. And so by systematically investing in the experience layer, we can really impact that trust over time. The other big trend that we've seen is the need to collaborate, right? And so as we've challenged the mission as it stands, we've run into areas where we have multiple federal partners that are needed to go after big systematic problems. And sometimes those aren't just federal partners, sometimes those are state and local partners, and sometimes those are private sector partners. And so this new kind of collaborative extended model of mission execution is something that I think we're seeing increasingly prevalent, especially with science-based organizations, that have to accomplish big things like, creating the next big breakthrough or getting human beings on new planets. Those types of things require a lot of collaboration across agency, even internationally. And then the last trend I'd say that's kind of universal is this increasing use of or opportunity to leverage the technologies that we have. And so I haven't spent a lot of time talking about the technology, but we hear a lot about ChatGPT, we hear a lot about automation. We mentioned RPA earlier. These are great opportunities, great tools that can be leveraged by the government. The government's doing a better job of getting those in the hands of mission owners. However, we still need to think about those people. We often are presented with opportunities for improvement of the processes, and the tools by themselves aren't a panacea.
Definitely want to come back around to the technology and the tools, but let me pop back to trust. It's one thing when I was doing research before our discussion today, trust, transparency popped up a lot as some of the key themes. We know trust in government matters. We know transparency from government matters. Does that change as the customer experience also kind of gets wedged in there, that, well, to create that better customer experience, I've got to be more transparent and more trustworthy in some way. And that may just be more perception than reality, meaning I was always trustworthy, but now it matters even more that I show you how I'm trustworthy. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing.
Yeah, so I think the idea of transparency and controlled transparency, right? Because there's, the line between being transparent and open and being, I think risky and insecure, and how we're viewing someone's data, for example, is pretty fine. And so we need to weigh those two things off of each other. And so, like, transparency is important. But so is trust in the use of data and how it's being leveraged, right? And so I think that as it relates to someone's service experience and their knowledge of their personal service experience, then transparency is like a great idea, and it can build trust. At the same time, there is risk that could be associated with too much transparency, or transparency where we haven't been given the right to extend it. And so I think that nuanced view of how we view data and in terms of the experience, and how that being really protective and a little bit risk averse in one way can help build trust. At the same time, extending transparency in other areas can also help build trust. And so that's really challenged internal to most agencies, their view of how they're viewing their information. And a perfect example is we often have classified materials. Sometimes folks are asking for them either through processes like FOIA, or there's an event and we need to get information out to the folks impacted by that event. And the agencies are being really challenged to, in some cases, declassify that data at the speed of the news cycle or events, to get it in the hands of the folks that matter and who can be helped by it. And so I think we're growing recognition that trust matters. Data and how we view it is part of that trust, and transparency is part of it. But we really do need to be, back to collaboration, very nuanced in our view, and also like understanding the impact that extending transparency can have on our mission partners, for example.
I'm glad you brought up the data piece, because I think data transparency, trust from the data, how data can drive that trust as well is all really important. And that actually gets us into the technology discussion. So it's a perfect segue, because if you can add automation, you can add robotics process automation and other tools, you can also free up agencies and personnel to help establish that trust, because then they can focus on what's more important. From a technology perspective, you've talked a little bit about software as a service, and we hit upon automation, RPA a little bit. What's the latest trend you're seeing around what agencies want from technology? Again, they want it all, and they want it to work, and they want to make it easy, but are you seeing a more move toward what these days?
Yeah, no, so I would say that this recognition that omni-channel is kind of table stakes, that we need to meet our customers where they are increasingly, and that can mean on a mobile device, on a desktop, or in person, right? And so this idea that there are, ideally we have a single front door, so to speak, for most of what we're trying to engage with the public around, but they might have their own preferred type of door, right? And so making sure that you are providing those different channels, and that you're connecting your systems and your engagement layers so that you can personalize that journey for customers becomes, a really important enabling capability that strategic platforms like Salesforce are uniquely positioned to provide to government agencies. The other part of this is that I want to highlight is okay, the why behind automation from someone who's actually deploying the mission or supporting the mission, and what's universal when I talk to folks is that the positive viewpoint on automation, what it can mean as someone who's executing the mission, is that they can focus on the part of their job that really matters, and so I like to think about this as mission over minutia. Right. And so like, if I'm helping someone, I want to focus on that person and I want to focus on the core part of my job. And I don't want to focus on the minutia of manual processes and swivel chair. And so I think that I'm an optimist at heart, and thinking about using AI and automation as really a force multiplier for the human element, I think is really where we need to be going as a country, frankly.
Michael, we got about a minute or so left, and I just want to kind of bring us back around to the beginning. We started off talking about digital transformation. I talked a little bit about customer experience. What's the big takeaway from our conversation today? What do you hope both listeners, government, and industry take away from where digital transformation is heading, and what agencies really should kind of keep in mind as they continue down this journey?
I would say, let's take a beginner's mindset, but let's honor the past and what's got us here. And so I think we wave the flag of change, but I also think that leveraging investments, leveraging what works is really important, and thinking about being collaborative, not just in how we're executing, but how we're thinking about planning and aligning around change is really important as well, because I think we've got the problems left on the table that we're not already solving effectively are those big, complex, hairy ones that are going to take time, incremental approach, patience to solve. And so we've got to all kind of work together to get there. And so bit of a kumbaya message, but I think it's easy to think about the tools and what are lanes, but often you got to look to your right and look to your left and make sure that you're heading in the right direction and that you're bringing everybody along with you.
And it sounds like to me, all the low-hanging fruit has been picked. We got to reach higher up into the tree to get some of those harder to reach areas and start working on those. And Mike, I'm sure we can talk longer, but unfortunately we are out of time for today. So let me thank my guest. Mike Shortino is the Principal Digital Strategist for Federal Civilian Government at Salesforce. Mike, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search innovation.